Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are walking right into a political firestorm, one that pits, well, the future of state convenience against decades of deeply ingrained civil liberties concerns.
The subject is mandatory digital ID in the UK.
And this wasn't just some routine parliamentary session, was it?
Not at all. This deep dive focuses on a debate in Westminster Hall on December 8, 2025. And crucially, a debate that was forced by public action.
Forced is absolutely the right word. The e-petition that demanded this discussion, number 730194, it didn't just get a few thousand signatures. It racked up nearly 3 million.
And stop right there. 3 million.
It's unbelievable.
In the history of parliamentary petitions, that makes it the fourth most signed petition ever. That is a seismic level of public concern, bordering on outrage, really.
It is, and it's the reason we're doing this analysis. Our mission today is to understand the core arguments from all sides, get to grips with why critics are calling this proposed system fundamentally un-British, and, I think most importantly, clarify the technical battleground.
Yes. The battle between surveillance fears and the government's promise of ultimate personal control. This is a crucial moment for you, the listener, to understand where technology and governance are about to intersect.
So let's start with the political reality of it. The thing that's so striking is the sheer cross-party opposition. I mean, we're talking about critics from the Conservatives, Greens, Reform, Lib Dems, Labour backbenchers, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Independents.
And parties from Northern Ireland. You just don't see that. You rarely, if ever, see that level of unified political resistance.
It tells you straight away this isn't a traditional left versus right issue.
No, it touches a much deeper, almost primal concern about the relationship between the citizen and the state. And that concern, well, it gets immediately amplified when you look at the costs.
Yes, the money. The latest estimate for this scheme, and this is from the Office for Budget Responsibility.
So the UK's independent financial watchdog.
Exactly. The estimate is a staggering $1.8 billion.
And critics were immediately on the attack. I mean, why spend nearly £2 billion on a brand new bureaucratic system when public services are struggling so badly?
Though, to be fair, the Secretary of State did signal they're going to issue a clearer, updated cost.
They did. But even so, it brings up the UK's long, and I mean long, complicated history with ID documents. There's a deep historical resistance here.
There really is. And it sets a pretty terrible precedent for what the government's trying to do now.
The theme is always, temporary power becomes permanent power. The first national ID card was introduced in 1939, World War II.
Sold as a temporary wartime measure.
Of course. But the police could demand to see it, and you'd face 6 months in prison for not complying.
And it wasn't ended until 1952, 7 years after the war was over.
And it was the Conservatives who finally scrapped it. So that public memory is of wartime urgency leading to peacetime intrusion.
Then you fast forward, Tony Blair's Labour government tried to bring them back during the War on Terror.
And again, stopped years later by the conservative Lib Dem coalition. And the most recent digital version of this we've seen was the 2021 COVID passport. This pattern just fuels the opposition's distrust.
So, if the history is complicated, the modern political mandate is, well, it's arguably absent.
That was one of the strongest points from the opposition. This digital ID policy was simply not in the current Labour Party's general election manifesto.
And that is the crisis of consent.
Exactly. The argument is that if you're going to fundamentally change how 67 million citizens prove their legal existence, you must have won the election on that specific promise. Without it, those 3 million signatures carry immense moral weight.
Okay, so without a clear electoral mandate for this new expensive system, what is the government's official justification?
They're saying it's about tackling illegal immigration and delivering government services.
But critics just called that a gimmick.
They did. They pointed out that countries that already have ID cards, places like Italy and Estonia, they still face issues with illegal arrivals, with large underground economies. So the ID card itself isn't some kind of magic bullet.
Which brings us to the core question that kept coming up in the debate.
Why?
Yes. Why do 67 million British citizens who already have passports, driving licenses, national insurance numbers, why do they need to be pulled into a brand new compulsory database if the target is illegal residents?
And that's the pivot into the technology, which is the real source of the fear here. We need to be really specific about what this digital ID is and what it is not.
Let's define the threat then, because this is where the conversation can get a bit hazy for people. We already have separate databases, HMRC for tax, NHS for health. What's the big technological leap that has critics so worried?
The worry is the creation of a single index term.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Your NI number is a key to your tax file. Your NHS number is a key to your medical file. They are currently distinct keys for separate siloed databases. The single index term is the master key, a unique identifier that can link those two separate silos, and eventually all of them, together, instantly.
So this new digital ID isn't just a new door. It's the key that allows someone to open all the existing doors at once, even if they were built to be separate.
That is the perfect analogy. It creates the potential for total immediate data aggregation, and that potential fuels the slippery slope argument.
Mission creep.
Mission creep. Critics worry that the initial uses, checking the right to work, right to rent, accessing benefits, will just expand, and that future governments, maybe 10 or 20 years from now, will use that seamless infrastructure to track and potentially control behavior at an ever finer level.
I do have to push back a bit on some of the language from the debate. I mean, critics were making explicit comparisons to the social credit system in China.
They were.
Where people on a blacklist can be stopped from buying train tickets or getting certain jobs. Is that just hyperbole, or is it a legitimate concern?
I think it's the alarm bell that civil liberties groups ring whenever they see centralized identity systems. It frames the debate in the most extreme dystopian terms.
A kind of political shorthand for total state control.
Exactly. It's a warning of a future command and control state governed by a cold computer says no logic, even if the current government has no such intentions.
And, alarmingly, they suggested this is all set to begin in childhood. What was a specific concern about the Children's Well-Being in Schools bill?
That bill was flagged because it could mandate the NHS number as the single unique identifier for every child in England.
From birth.
From birth. And critics argue that linking health, education, and social service data like that is it's fraught with risk. Specifically, the accidental disclosure of deeply sensitive data like the new address of a family fleeing domestic abuse, for example.
So if that's the fear of overreach, let's talk about the tech itself. The government claims this will be highly secure, but critics basically called a national database a true honeypot for hackers.
And the evidence they presented for that was, well, it was compelling and very recent. They cited a whole litany of massive UK data breaches.
The NHS?
The NHS, the British Library, the Legal Aid Agency, and the Police Service of Northern Ireland, which infamously published the personal data of all its officers.
It's hard to feel secure when the very institutions we trust right now can't seem to hold on to our data.
Precisely. This lack of competence fuels the public distrust. And the international examples were just as bad. Estonia, which is often held up as a digital success story, lost 280,000 digital ID photos in 2021. India's system resulted in the largest data breach ever globally.
Wow.
And perhaps most worrying, critics cited evidence that cybersecurity specialists had already managed to infiltrate the underlying code of the existing One login system.
The very foundation this new ID is being built on.
The very foundation. If that's shaky, then everything built on top of it is at risk.
And beyond security, there's the huge social concern of digital exclusion.
This is absolutely critical. Ofcom estimates that 4.5 million people in the UK either don't own a smartphone or really struggle with digital literacy.
And this disproportionately affects older residents, vulnerable groups.
It does. And the risk here isn't just inconvenience. It's systemic exclusion. It creates what they called a two-tier Britain,
where your access to a job, to housing, healthcare, even voting.
It all becomes dependent on having the right app on the right phone. You're effectively creating a disadvantaged class overnight.
Which feeds into that final fear. Putting our most sensitive data into the hands of private, perhaps overseas, individuals.
Yes, the outsourcing risk, the fear that the state will hand ultimate responsibility and therefore power to corporations who might not have our best interests at heart.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the criticisms, and they are severe. But for balance, we absolutely have to give weight to the arguments for this. The government supporters, people like Peter Prinsley and Tony Vaughan, they made a clear case that the opponents were missing the point.
They really did. They argued that the critics were focusing on fears about how it's implemented, not the principle itself. Supporters see digital ID as a vital step into the modern world.
They said it would revolutionize public services.
Yes, by creating a single, secure credential. So you wouldn't need to keep pulling out multiple documents, utility bills, all that stuff, just to prove who you are.
You mentioned the NHS earlier. How would this specifically help a service like that?
Well, a former surgeon who spoke in the debate described the daily struggle of accessing patient information that's currently scattered across different hospital trusts. A unified digital ID could let a patient instantly and securely provide access to their full unified record.
Which means faster, safer, more efficient care.
That's the argument. And economically, the idea is that the system pays for itself through reduced fraud, making the UK a more competitive digital economy.
And the government's defense, it really hinged on two key promises, right?
It did. First, that the scheme will be voluntary and free to the citizen.
Though critics would say it's certainly not free to the taxpayer.
A fair point. And second, that the ID will be stored on your personal device, putting you, not the state, in control of sharing.
But the minister's main job in that debate was to dismantle the central fear, centralization. How did they argue that this would not become that master key we talked about?
This is the most crucial piece of the puzzle. The minister was forceful. They stated they are not creating a centralized master database. Instead, the system will be federated.
Okay, let's define federated for everyone listening. If a centralized system is one giant vault where all the data lives, what's a federated one?
A federated system is more like a carefully linked library. The book, your data, they stay on their different shelves in their different buildings, guarded by separate librarians.
So with the NHS, HMRC, the DWP.
Exactly. The digital ID provides a single entry point for verification, but when you use it, the data is pulled in real time from its original separate source. It is not copied and stored in a new central vault.
So the security promise is that the system only points to the separate data sources. It never collects them all in one place.
Precisely. And this decentralized architecture is governed by what they called strict legal firewalls and a principle of data minimization.
Meaning only the bare minimum gets shared, so not your full birth certificate, just a, yes, this person is over 18.
Exactly. And crucially, it requires your explicit, active consent for every single piece of data that is shared.
That distinction, federated versus centralized, that is the entire defense against the single index term fear. What about digital exclusion? How did the minister address the 4.5 million people?
They promised a massive digital inclusion drive. The plan is to invest in physical access points, so post offices, libraries, to help vulnerable citizens get access to services without needing a smartphone. The stated goal is that no one gets left behind.
And finally, on the fears of state overreach, the social credit system stuff.
The minister made an extremely clear commitment. He promised legislation will create a defined legal framework to prevent scope creep. He confirmed the UK will, quote, never have a social credit system. And he used a powerful phrase to counter those historical fears.
What was that?
He said, no card, no papers, no police. Stressing that because it's voluntary and because the ID lives on your device, the citizen always remains in charge.
So, after this deep dive, what we're left with is this fundamental conflict. You have a government striving for modern, efficient services, running headlong into a public that is deeply distrustful of state power and, frankly, worried about technological incompetence.
It's a confrontation between promised convenience and entrenched civil liberty. And ultimately, this whole debate is a question of trust. The digital ID is just the surface issue.
Underneath it.
Underneath, you see the tension between democratic accountability, that astonishing 3 million signatures, and government action. The minister's assurances were powerful, but many observers felt the debate exposed a worrying gap between the public will and the government's determination to press ahead regardless.
It really puts the onus on what comes next. The minister promised a federated system, strict legal firewalls, all to prevent mission creep.
And that's the core tension for you to consider. If the architecture really is a federated library, not a central vault, and the law promises to keep it that way, what level of future political transparency and independent tech auditing would it actually take to convince a deeply skeptical public that the slippery slope to centralized universal control has been permanently blocked? That lingering doubt is the real legacy of this whole debate.